The New York City Housing Authority, or NYCHA as it's better known as, is the oldest and largest public housing authority on the continent, existing for 89 years and housing over 360,000 residents across the city since its inception in 1934. And it's horrible. Similar to another city agency, NYCHA isn't exactly having a great time. For starters, the agency needs nearly $80 billion on repairing just their crumbling buildings alone, and crumble these buildings do. NYCHA residents are often subject to broken boilers causing no heat or hot water for weeks on end, steam pipes frequently bursting, preceding falling ceiling tiles and flooding, and brick facades getting so bad it's deemed dangerous to live there. Matter of fact, in this example, they installed scaffolding to protect unsuspecting pedestrians from falling bricks, and kept it that way, at least until a massive section of the facade fell and struck a sidewalk shed. And these are simply scratching the surface. All it takes is a short glance at the state of NYCHA for the question to arise: how does it get this bad, and why? Well, first we have to look into the history. Again, created in 1934 by then Mayor LaGuardia, yes, that's the same LaGuardia, as a response to both the housing crisis during the Great Depression and as a response to the tenements, NYCHA was funded by the federal government, and the program slowly expanded throughout the next 3 decades, from the first set of buildings in the Lower East Side to around 152 developments in all 5 boroughs by 1970, which seemed to be NYCHA's peak. In the 70s, NYCHA's projects were actually among the best places to live in the city, and were peaceful and stable, especially compared to their surroundings. NYCHA was also well funded, well enough to where if there was a problem, they would immediately come and fix it. They had 17,000 employees, more than today's 13,000, and not to mention its own police force at 2,700. But then, in the late 80s, things began to change. The crack epidemic was sweeping through the country, and this had its effect on NYCHA too. In an article from the New York Times, people who lived in NYCHA buildings at the time comment on this, saying,
When the crack epidemic came,
no, that's not his actual voice line.
When the crack epidemic came, it took over. There were fights every day, shootouts every day, people playing music outside your building to get someone out to fight.
Every place you step, you would step on a crack bottle. Back in the 80s, a long time ago in Grant, you would be afraid to walk down the steps because they had a bunch of crack bottles and they would get stuck in the groove of your shoe.
But usually, these were only caused by a small number of bad actors, and the buildings themselves generally still remained in good working order, and not, falling apart at the seams. Though by 2000, this would change too. NYCHA found itself getting swept by disinvestment and mismanagement. The buildings themselves were beginning to deteriorate, often being overtaken by mold and other problems mentioned earlier, while upper management seemed not to care. The agency had billions of its funding being taken away from it, all while extreme weather events such as Hurricane Sandy hit NYCHA residents the hardest. So diverted funds are a problem. However, NYCHA seems to also have a hard time with the money it has too. Part of the problem is actually NYCHA's unpaid rent, which sits at over $338 million and is still going up. And this isn't mentioning that $78 billion needed for repairing the NYCHA buildings. Many units are also vacant, nearly 3,600, which increased 6-fold within a year. So now that we know a few reasons NYCHA has spiraled into what it is today, what's being done to help it now? Well, there's actually a PAC program which will give $7.2 billion in building upgrades to NYCHA buildings. Last year, $2 billion was granted to renovate over 8,000 apartments. This time, there's actually meaningful progress being made, though whether the program will actually come to fruition or not is anyone's guess. So if we were to restore NYCHA to, for lack of a better term, its former glory, how could it be done? 1. You'd have to repair all the crumbling buildings. As revealed before, NYCHA's buildings are aging badly, and they would collectively need $78 billion to repair all the faults, such as the heating systems and mold problems. This would also help the vacancy problem. 2. You'd have to employ many more people. In 1970, when NYCHA had 17,000 employees, they had less developments and therefore less residents, compared to now when they have 4,000 less, but much more developments. There's less employees and they're all spread out more, leading to the infamous wait times. Of course, like anything, this needs funding, and securing funding for anything is very difficult. Not only would you have to get the funding up front, but also keep it. Disinvestment is how NYCHA got to this point in the first place. In the end, NYCHA's issues reflect a larger issue with public programs and agencies not only in the city, but really the whole country. Insufficient funding and mismanagement have been or are currently plaguing many other public agencies. The MTA, the NYPL, Amtrak, and others all suffer from such. If NYCHA's funds hadn't been cut decades ago, it wouldn't have fallen, or at least as bad as it did. And it serves as a consistent reminder as to why public agencies like NYCHA should never be disinvested in the way it was. Okay, look, I can explain. October, November, December, yeah, it's been about 4 months. Listen, hear me out. So remember when I said this year's looking painful at last intro? It turns out I have perfect eyesight. But hey, I'm back. Ignore that. Ignore that thing right there. Okay, but let's get down to business. You might have seen a frankly drastic change in editing, and that's because I used After Effects for most of this video, instead of that mobile editor from before. And yes, I'm aware Premiere Pro exists. I'm leaving it undelivered for reasons. And if anything, tell me what you think about the new style that I had to manually plot like half the projects in existence by 1970 in these maps, and I still enjoyed it somehow like the psychopath I am. I genuinely forgot how to end these. Like, do I just say something crazy like, farewell young traveler, and the video will just automatically